And inside the figure was a papyrus, and it was the papyrus of a man called Jedptari Uefank. Welcome to MHA Digital Communities. I'm Bryony and I am the Collections Officer here at Macclesfield Museums. Now at the moment we're in the Egyptian collection, and I'd like to draw your attention to these two figures behind me. You've got a black and white one and then a very colourful one next to it. In fact, these are two different types of the same object, an Osiris figure and a Ptah Osiris figure. Now, the Osiris figure is very distinct in the way it appears, and that's because it's shaped like the god Osiris, who was the god of death in ancient Egypt, or more specifically, he was the god of rebirth after death, which is why you see him on all sorts of funerary objects like coffins and books of the dead and that kind of thing. Now here we have an object that is shaped entirely like Osiris. So you've got his signature headdress, which is the Atef crown, and also if you look very closely you can see across his chest there's the crook and the flail, which you're probably more familiar with from objects like Tutankhamun's sarcophagus. Now the figurine on the right looks a lot more lavish. It's got gilding, it's got bright colours, it's got an inscription on it even. But actually it's the one on the left that I think is more interesting. Now it doesn't look it, but it's got a lot of hidden stories that make it much more interesting in my eyes. So let's go and have a look at it. So this piece is particularly interesting. It's an Osiris figurine, which means that it's from quite late on in ancient Egyptian history. It's a burial artifact, so it was put into burials with dead ancient Egyptians. Now, when I say that it's quite late on in ancient Egyptian history, this particular piece dates to the 21st dynasty, and you can tell that because of the style of the piece. From the 21st dynasty onwards, the style of these changed slightly in terms of where the cavity was, because inside this figure there is actually a hollow, and the way that they made this particular figure was that they hollowed out the back and then put a piece of wood to cover it up so that there was a hole in the middle. Now you might be wondering why there's a hole in the middle of this object, and that was to hold a papyrus. Now the papyrus that this Osiris figurine held is very interesting, partly because it's currently missing and nobody knows where it is. So the way that this came into the collection was that Marianne Brocklehurst bought the figurine on her very first trip to Egypt. And she bought the figurine from the Abd al-Rasul dealers. Now they'd recently found a cache of royal mummies, and this is thought to have been inside it. And so Marianne and Mary bought this figure from the Abd al-Rasuls, and inside the figure was a papyrus, and it was the papyrus of a man called Jedptari Uefank, who lived around the 21st dynasty. So it all sort of fits together. Now, Jedptari Uefank held a title which was the royal son of Kush, which at the time people thought meant that he was a prince at the time that Marianne was around, but it turns out that it's just a title. But you can see that there's black details on it, and this is probably a type of resin that covers the figure. Now we've actually had this figure x-rayed, and from the x-rays you can see that these little additions to the headdress, which are really characteristic of Osiris as a god, were actually added in later, so you can learn a bit about the construction of the Osiris figure. Now you can probably see that there's a bit missing at the bottom. Originally this would have come out to a bigger stand. And in fact in later Ptah Osiris figurines, which is the later edition of this kind of object, the cavity is inside the base instead of in the object itself, which would have made it a lot easier to manufacture. You can imagine, instead of carving out the figure and then carving out a little hollow, just having it in a sort of box base.